I started my revenue cycle career well over 20 years ago. And you don't go to college to become a revenue cycle operator. It's something that you kind of fall into. And so a lot of your perceptions of how to be the best revenue cycle operator are formed by your observations, formed by who are you leading from, formed by, kind of the philosophies of the organizations that you work under. And I grew up in the revenue cycle at a time when, I saw the evolution of payer-provider relationships really go downhill, I would say. When I first started, most of our contracts were percent of charges. If you got the insurance right, you put the charges on the bills went out the door, and there were some things that obviously required authorization, but for the most part, they were percent of charge contracts. And over the last 20 years, the administrative burden between payers and providers has just continued to escalate. And growing up or growing a career in the revenue cycle at that time, I suppose I over time hardened my perspective that you just have to fight with payers. And that's really the only strategy. Sometimes you can negotiate with payers about the rate, but there's really not a lot you can do. There's very little leverage that you can have in how you engage with a payer at the individual claim level. And whether or not someone taught me that intentionally or unintentionally, we could probably debate. I know that it was reinforced in multiple organizations that the only methodology was to just be adversarial with payers. And my perspective since joining Trend has just completely changed. My observation, I would say that my beliefs have been challenged, and I realize now that some of my thought processes really did not serve me as a revenue cycle leader. Probably could not have convinced me of that at the time, but I do think that more collaboration and trying to understand the other side, it leads to better outcomes. I think the biggest fallacy that I have really wrestled with and had just to completely shift my thinking is the concept of intent. And I believed that the intention on both sides was to create an adversarial relationship. And, over the course of my career, certainly the more I've gotten to understand the payer side, since joining Trend, that intent really lives in people's heads. It's just not at all the way that either side wants to go about their work. At the end of the day, whether you call them a patient or a member, people want to do the right thing. Organizations, whether they're a payer or a provider, they want their patients to be cared for. They want their members to be cared for. They want people to be treated fairly. But they also want clarity in what does this encounter mean, and how do we adjudicate the care that was given to this patient or this member through the process of the healthcare reimbursement system. And it's just really complicated. And within those complex, contract provisions, payment provisions, authorization requirements, coordination of benefits requirements, it takes a lot of effort to get to the truth. And the truth is really just, was medically necessary care given? Was it well documented? Who is ultimately liable for this particular encounter? Is it a medical insurance? Is it a workers' comp insurance? Is it an MVA? Is it, it's just incredibly complex. And it takes a lot of people kind of speaking all the same language in order to get to the truth. The thinking that there's a pool of money that if you act fast enough, you can win over the other side, I think is a thinking that a lot of people share on both sides. If you're smart enough, you can apply the rules in such a way to give yourself an advantage. And when you think about it that way, you're really getting into the nuance of each individual claim, each individual line inside of that claim, the adjudication and contract rules that govern each individual charge as a component of that claim. You know, that's pennies. You're fighting over pennies, and it's almost like you can't see the forest for the trees. And when you're fighting to keep the pennies, which a lot of people feel like they need to do. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but when our focus is on the pennies, we're stepping over the dollars to pick up the pennies. And those dollars are represented in the cost associated with the fight. And my observation is that pool of money is much, much larger than people really are giving it credit for. The amount of people that you have, if you're in an electronic medical record, and the amount of people that you have printing electronic medical record charts and mailing them through the mail, and the postage associated with mailing it only for it not to be received in the right place at the right time. I mean, the cost to that alone is staggering. Isn't there a better way? Isn't there a better way to just be transparent and exchange information and say, here's why we made the clinical decisions that we made in the case of this patient? Do we have to print thousands of pages? Do we have to put it in snail mail? Why do we do that? Wouldn't our time and energy be much better served if we figured out a more efficient way to reduce that cost versus fight over some arbitrary dollars? In healthcare, there are so many places that you can focus. You can focus your resources, you can focus your time, you can focus your priorities, and it's very easy in healthcare reimbursement to be so inundated with the things that are coming at you, the minutia that's coming at you, the individual claim that needs to be followed up on, and all of that kind of stuff, that it's very, very difficult to almost like lift your head above that and see, how can I solve these problems in bigger chunks? And who's the right partner to partner with me solving for these problems in bigger chunks? In the vendor landscape, it's very easy to look at a bucket of work, give it to a vendor partner to just keep doing the same thing the same way and just take some of that work off your plate because you need immediate relief. I mean, there's no question that everybody's fighting that battle. The challenge is, as executives and leaders, is to look beyond that, to kind of like look beyond that very immediate horizon, to be like, okay, what is that business decision gonna get me? It's gonna get me a little bit of relief and a little bit of pickup in performance, but I am always going to be tied to this methodology because that's what I've solved for. I have created solutions that exacerbate the current set of circumstances. I think it would be very interesting if we all sought out vendors that were looking to actually change the circumstances instead of just figuring out how to make money in the current set of circumstances. Like, that's really not all that interesting. That is not all that creative. Are people going to make money? Sure. Are payers going to make money? Sure. Providers are going to protect a little bit of their margin? Absolutely. Vendors are going to make a lot of money, right? Because they've figured out how to operate on the hamster wheel. Aren't we just continuing the hamster wheel by doing that? Wouldn't it be better if a group of us came together and said, let's just get the hamster wheel to stop for a minute. And if you can get the hamster wheel to stop for a minute, don't you have more clarity? Can't you see more opportunities? Look beyond the horizon. And instead of fighting to be right, fighting for your position to be represented or heard or solved, think about all the different perspectives, all the stakeholders. Solve a problem that makes it better for both the payer and the provider, or ideally, all three, the payer, the provider, and the patient. I feel confident there are so many solutions where everybody wins if we can just have better conversations. We can think about, tell me what you're trying to solve for. As a payer, you're trying to solve for utilization. You're trying to solve for getting patients to update their COB. Like, there's all these things that payers are trying to solve for that providers can help, and vice versa. But because we're fighting over, kind of the hungry hippo concept, we're fighting over the marble because we're frenzied. If we can stop the frenzy and just take a beat and think about the healthcare continuum, think about all the stakeholders, I feel confident we can design better solutions.